Now resume.
For the Conservation Coalition. The remainder of my questions are for you, Dr. Riddell. I was intrigued by the smoked tagging study that you did on Choco, with the Choco smolts, and with your finding that they experienced a high degree of in-river out-migration mortality before they reached the Strait of Georgia. The first question is, as I understand, also they exhibited a high rate of mortality once they were in the Strait of Georgia as well, so that the next time that you picked up signals in Queen Charlotte Strait or Queen Charlotte Sound, they were further reduced. Is that right?
Yes, we had survival rate estimates from Choco Lake to the mouth of the Fraser River. And then we have a line about central Strait of Georgia. It's the top of Texada to Hornby Island and across. And they had a longer period of residence in that area and some continued mortality, but their survival rate was quite high in that area. There's then a long migration of probably 200 kilometers from the top of that line to the outlet of Queen Charlotte Sound. And we only observed, I believe it was 3 or 4 tags at that point. So the mortality was very high from the northern part of the Strait of Georgia through Johnston Strait. And we saw no tags going out through Juan de Fuca, but it was a line for a detection of tagged fish as well.
I was reminded when you were giving your evidence of Dr. Welsh's evidence, who came earlier and presented a similar study that he had done on smolts in Cultus Lake. I believe that he radio tagged smolts from Cultus Lake and was able to track them through, right through to the Strait of Georgia and then out to sea. And did he show the same degree of mortality in river and their out migration pattern?
Not quite. No, Dave applied the same type of tags to very large smolts because they were reared at Rosewall Creek and then brought back, and they were very big animals to carry this tag. And they moved very, very rapidly down the Cultus Lake, right. Swelter Creek, into the Fraser and out. And there was only 2 or 3 days there. And they had a pretty high survival in that trip. But I think many people are concerned, and Dave's, is that it's a nice demonstration of the technology in itself, but the fish were so large that we don't believe that they're representative of the natural populations. But they did follow a very similar pattern of mortality through the Strait of Georgia.
That you saw in your Choco smolts?
Yes.
In the order of magnitude, I think the Cultus Lake smolts were 20 centimeters roughly, and yours were something in the range of 8 or 9. Is that right?
No, that's not right. Actually, ours were much larger.
Okay.
And that the 8 or 9 is probably a comment that Timber made, because that's roughly 8 is about the size of a 1-year-old smolt, 8 centimeters. The 2-year-old smolts are larger than that, and the fish that we tagged were down to about 11.5 centimeters. So ours were atypical in the natural range. They were the largest naturally produced fish, but they're still bigger than the typical smolt leaving the Fraser River.
Do I have it right that with respect to our ability to capture smolts, that there's only 2 locations where we can do that currently? One is obviously the Choco, at the outlet of Choco Lake into Choco River, and the other one is Swelter Creek or into the Cultus Lake pattern. Is that right?
It's the only 2 places that we have fences that facilitate handling fish easily. There are other places where you could capture smolts, but those are the only 2 fences where you can work easily to get the fish with minimal harm to the animals.
Would you agree as a scientist that it would be of some scientific benefit to have another additional place that we can conduct a study to make further determinations of what's going on in terms of the mortality pattern?
Well, if we continue to see that if we can demonstrate that the natural populations are suffering mortality rates like these larger smolts, and I think, as I said yesterday, my concern is that why would you assume that small smolts are going to have a much higher survival rate than large smolts? There are some reasons you can postulate, but I think we need to demonstrate that. If we're actually losing fish along the migration routes leaving, then yes, it would be advantageous to have other sites tagged so that we can actually look at what type of loss, what's causing the loss. We don't have any idea what that is. The obvious examples are predation, And now with this concern about a virus-like signature in some fish, maybe there is a fish health issue involved that could be brought out by rate of passage and stress. But we need to really do some additional science on that component as well.
That leads me into the next line of questions, which focuses upon your comment that if you want to tackle the scientific explanation of why we have fluctuating populations or returns, for example, the declines that we saw exhibited in the first part of this decade, culminating in the decline of 2009, and then the increase or the abundance in 2010, that the best place in your estimation would be to examine the Strait of Georgia to see if there's something going on in the Strait of Georgia. Do I have that right?
Yes, I think the only thing I qualified later, I came back and said, and we shouldn't forget that there is this compounding factor of the fish health issue now, that if the fish are carrying something that we don't fully understand, but it does look disease-like, or viral signature they refer to, then that may confound what's going on in the Strait of Georgia. But the Strait of Georgia has been largely neglected as a major study in terms of ecosystems that salmon all use. And there really hasn't been a comprehensive study of this strait and what determines marine survival in the early phase. Most countries around the North Pacific are certainly coming to agreement that the majority of the survivorship in terms of numbers of animals does occur in the early marine period, probably a month to 2 months even.
If you were to try to delineate where in Georgia Strait you would best conduct those studies, where would you postulate would be a good place to start?
Well, we've actually talked about that quite a bit in the last couple of years. I'm not sure that we would guess at a place to start. I think you need to clearly, if you believe that the mortality is during the early period and is compounding through time, then you probably need to start close to the river. We do know that from the tagging studies that have been done that there is a prolonged period of use of the estuarine environment between the mouth of the river and the first post array at the top of Texada Island. So they do use that for a fair period of time. So you clearly have to do some investigation in there. And then I think there's a natural division that you need to study the northern portion of the Strait of Georgia at that time. And then you probably have to look at Johnston Strait pretty much as a whole, just because it's such an incredibly difficult environment to work in. So you could measure before and then basically after.
All right. You alluded to the, I think yesterday as well as just recently, to the health issue. And you referenced a paper by Dr. Christy Miller from DFO that was, I think, recently published in the scientific journal Science, and in which she hypothesized that there was a genomic signature that was linked to pre-spawn mortality and in-river mortality and some sort of a virus-like disease that was in the fish. Have you been following that?
Yes.
And would that be something worthwhile for this commission to investigate and look into?
Oh, absolutely. We've been looking at this for a while. I've been following naturally because Christy was in my division before I left the department. And as my background is genetics, we spend quite a bit of time talking about this, although I'm not sure I even understand genetics anymore the way it's evolved. I think when you find something that this really, really startling thing with Christie's work is the use of these genomic arrays. So I think if you look at the websites, you can see 16,000 cells on basically something about the size of a slide that you would have used in university. And in Christie's work, what she was finding is that fish that were described as healthy had no pattern on the array, as if there was largely green and things. The appropriate genes were active and not active at the right time. Fish that were unhealthy had this incredibly distinct signature, where about half of the array was actually turned off inappropriately. And so that's where we immediately started looking at, what could possibly be going on where you've got such a striking difference between fish all returning in the same year. Now, the other thing that enabled us to really tie this down, of course, is that using DNA, you can identify where you expect these fish to go. So you knew the population of origin, and then with radio tagging, you could follow these fish through the system and determine the fish that you knew where it was going and you knew its genotypic signature, the healthy, unhealthy, then you could equate it to the fate of the radio tag that you had put on that fish. And so it's a really good example of putting all the tools we have together to try and really improve our understanding. It's a very, very nice piece of work.
To lend support to your theory that Georgia Strait would be the place to examine, I would suggest to you that the Harrison River sample might lend some support for that, because unlike some of the other declines that we saw in the first part of this decade up into 2009, we saw that the Harrison River stocks were actually, or the Harrison River CUs were increasing. Mm-hmm. And they do not follow that same period of migration out Georgia Strait, as I understand it. They actually follow a more southerly route out to the ocean, mostly through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and then up the west coast of Vancouver Island. Would you agree with my principle that tends to lend support to your hypothesis that we should be examining the Strait of Georgia?
Yes, I do. I would add that not only do they use the strait longer, they go out to sea at a very different time. So they are not really seen in samples, and as I just said, we can recognize all of the populations with DNA sampling now. So when you do sampling on the Strait of Georgia sockeye in July, you do not see Harrison sockeye. When you start your sampling in September, 90+% of your samples are Harrison sockeye. Now that population is not so large that it should overwhelm everything else, so that is not the reason. So what's really happened is the vast majority of the other Fraser sockeye have now left the Strait of Georgia, and you're really seeing Harrison River utilization of the strait, and they do very, very well. They grow very rapidly. So they're in there in August through September. There have been cruises in November when they're still there. All right, now the abundance is starting to drop, and they're more widely distributed. The only thing I'd caution on is I don't think the evidence for them all going south or not going north is all that strong yet. Because of the concerns you have on tagging these fish. If you could get large enough fish in the strait in September, you could probably put post tags on and monitor some of the movement of the fish, but that hasn't been done yet because many of the fish are not large enough to tag. So, I mean, I'm still a little bit mixed on how strong the argument is. That I think their survivorship is that they're doing very well in the Strait of Georgia and that they're healthy enough to survive either way they go. But you are right, the prevailing thought now is that they go out the south. The evidence for that is that they're seen on the west coast of Vancouver Island. But there's not as intensive sampling in the north to really prove that they go both ways. So that's my concern at this point.
All right, thank you for that. Those are my questions.
My name is Don Rosenblum. I appear on behalf of Area D Gillnet and Area B Sainer. I have a number of questions for both of you. Firstly, Mr. Whitehouse, yesterday you testified about the Nursery Lake Assessment Program, and you and I tried to speed this cross-examination up a little bit, and having had a chat just before your testimony this morning. And if I can summarize what I understand from you so that it goes onto the record, the Nursery Lake Assessment Program is a part of a habitat assessment. You would call it a habitat assessment, but it's focused exclusively on capacity of a lake system to, in terms of the food source for fry that have obviously come from the river system into the nursery lake. Is that correct to say?
With one provision, not exclusively. The primary focus is identifying the ability of a lake to support sockeye, and it examines a number of parameters, biological, physical, and chemical, and including other components of the ecosystem in the lake to understand the relationship between those components and that lake's ability to support sockeye.
Yes, and so obviously part of your work is determining the capacity of a lake system to nurse and nourish a stock, a sockeye stock. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you would subscribe to the belief that there obviously is a threshold in terms of capacity wherein the number of fry will reach overcapacity of the lake to feed and nourish that stock?
What is clearly demonstrable in the work associated with evaluating the freshwater rearing capacity in nursery lakes is that density of sockeye fry, or in the case of lakes where there are multiple species that target on the same food resources, plankton eating species, there's a link between the densities that recruit into the lake and the productive capacity of the system. And there are ways to model, looking at environmental variables, what that capacity is.
Yes, sir. And one of the critical consequences of what I'll call an overcapacity of stock in a lake is that those fry do not feed to the extent of being the size that one would normally see in a lake system, correct?
One of the impacts of high density can be a depression in growth rate, so that at higher densities you will see a reduced size of fry produced.
And this is obviously trite, but the consequence of that situation is that those fish have a lesser survival rate than obviously fish that are of what we'll call a normal size. A higher mortality.
There is a conventional perspective that fish size does relate to survival, and that the smaller you are, the lower your potential survival rates are. But that, as Dr. Riddle spoke earlier, there is work that needs to confirm that across the life history stages, particularly from the point where fish leave the lake to the point that they make marine entry.
It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? I appreciate you don't necessarily have scientific evidence of it, but the fact is a smaller smolt is more susceptible to predation than otherwise.
I don't think we can hold that as being a completely broad, acceptable broad statement. Size varies across year to year, amongst a wide range of species, and you see variable survival rates where small fish in one year do as well as large fish in another. The key is making the linkage between density and the potential impacts, and you have to think a little broader than simply size. And one example of what I'm talking about here would be the impact of very large spawning populations arriving in a lake and delivering nutrients to that system. So there can actually be an impact of sockeye on subsequent generations. They fertilize the lake with their carcasses in some instances. So you have to really study the nutrient budgets and the dynamics of the various trophic web components to understand what the ultimate impact to the rearing capacity in the system is going to be.
Well, let's try to make this really simple. You would agree with me that the optimum productivity of a stock is dependent in part on the fry being properly nourished in a lake, in the nursery lake.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
And that being the case, obviously the carrying capacity of the lake to provide that nourishment to those fry is obviously relevant to those of you that are looking at productivity issues.
Yes, carrying capacity is important.
Thank you. Now, in speaking about the Nursery Lake Assessment Program, I heard you to testify yesterday, and please correct me if I misrepresent your evidence, that currently there are really 3 nursery lake assessment programs going on, or areas, I should say, where you are carrying on these assessments. Is that correct?
That is correct. We've been able to continue to deliver at the Shuswap system, at Quesnel Lake, and in the Choco system.
And am I not correct in hearing from you that prior to the 1985, a critical year for reasons we all know in this room, there was a more extensive program of nursery lake assessment.
I would characterize the work that went on in the old IPSFC days as being extensive, providing broad synoptic overview of a large number of lakes within the Fraser watershed. When DFO assumed responsibility for those activities in '86, there was another concerted effort on DFO's behalf, linked to the Lake Enrichment Program, to do a very broad synoptic survey of most of the major nurseries within the Fraser watershed. And then since that time, since the approximately early 90s, is when we saw a tailing off in the amount of directed lake assessment and focusing on key primary nurseries like the three mentioned.
All right. And let's be blunt about it. Surely, from your perspective, it is not favorable to stock analysis that these programs have been more limited in more recent time.
I see these as important assessments.
And my question to you, sir, is can you explain to this commission why there has been such a diminishment of effort to carry out a more extensive program on nursery lake assessment?
I think we touched on a number of the aspects of this yesterday associated with the meeting obligations to the Pacific salmon, treaty salmon, Fraser sockeye salmon assessment framework, where under fairly onerous budgetary constraints, we were in a position that finding ways to keep all of the assessment components functionally active. Hard decisions had to be made given reduced budgets, what could be afforded. And these lake assessments fell victim to that.
And that's a tragedy, isn't it, in terms of the kind of focus that we have at this commission today to try to explain things in terms of runs and run size? First of all,
Yeah.
sorry, Mr.
I think a tragedy is quite a strong statement. I think that there is clearly value added to the overall information available to assess Fraser sockeye stocks, that the work that has been able to be maintained has focused on those areas where we had the highest priority issues, understanding what was going on, where density level impacts were coming into play. But we have missed some opportunity to understand what's going on a broader base in the larger suite of nursery systems within the Fraser. I should state that there has been considerable additional work outside of the Fraser, and it's important on nursery lakes. It's important to note that the department has, where it has the opportunity, attempted to ensure that a ecosystem-based approach to sockeye assessment has been supportable to the extent possible.
Yes. Dr. Riddell wanted to say something.
Well, I think Timber touched on it. I think a tragedy is a bit of an overstatement for the loss. We're talking about a loss of one or two of the production lakes that would really have made any difference at all. And that it'd be nice to survey many of the lakes and look at the population dynamics in the lake. But to be fair, I mean, we're talking about the loss in Stewart Lake, which I personally think we need to go back and look at to determine how we recover that lake. And secondly, you have Francois Lake, which is actually not very productive. And that, so I mean, the impact of the juvenile surveys to ensure we could cover the others, I think tragic overstates it. Is it preferable? Absolutely. But the other comment I was going to make, and Timber just sort of touched on this at the end, but a different reason. Under the IPSFC, you did have more broad coverage, but more limited information captured. And that under the government of Canada, when they took over, I mean, you maintain the fall survey so that we have the Fry enumeration so we can look at survivorship in the lakes. There's an entire research branch that was added under Dr. John Stockner that for years have been looking at what limits productivity in sockeye lakes, and that's a much, much more detailed assessment of the limnology. I think I went through this yesterday. You talk about the basin morphology, the turnover rate in the lake, and the development along the shoreline, contaminants, and so on. So there was a much more intensive study of some of the lakes. That's not to cover off the loss of the fry data, but there were two components in this limnological work.
Thank you. Throughout this hearing, we of course hear about Cultus Lake repeatedly. My question to you, Mr. Whitehouse, is why would there not be a nursery lake assessment analysis done for Cultus Lake in light of its sensitivities?
There has been a considerable amount of habitat-based evaluation and assessment that does go on at Cultus, including opportunistic. We have a particular benefit of having a research facility sited on the shores or immediately at the outlet of that lake, the Cultus Lake Lab. So there is the ability to do research related to habitat issues within that system, including working on the fry distribution studies and at very minimal and marginal add-on cost. So associated with recovery planning, the conservation team efforts that are going on at Cultus Lake, there are extensive habitat-based assessments in that system, including evaluation of spawning habitat, the impact of invasive aquatic weeds, the impact of shoreline development on spawning habitat within the system. These have been integral parts to a very intensive evaluation of the potential impacts of habitat degradation, including effects of predators and competitors within that system.
Well, I may be misleading you, but I was present when your colleague, Ms. Stahl, testified before these proceedings, and I hope I state her evidence correctly, that she testified that there has not been a habitat status report done for Cultus Lake to the best of her knowledge, and I don't think anyone has challenged that in evidence given subsequently. Do you agree with that testimony? And wouldn't she be the one that would be aware of it?
I'm not...
Stahlberg, I'm sorry.
Stahlberg,
I believe her name was Stahlberg.
Okay. She may be talking about a formal habitat-based assessment that meets a particular set of criteria. I think we have had a status review of Cultus Lake that has run through the CSAS process within the past year, evaluating the restoration activities going on, including making comment on habitat components and uncertainty associated with the various recovery strategies that we've talked there. So it may be that Ms. Stahlberg was talking about a different type of report. There has been directed work associated with evaluating habitat status and recovery in Cultus.
Well, let me ask you this. Are you satisfied of the habitat analysis work that has been done on Cultus over, let's say, the last 5 to 10 years? Do you feel that it is providing you as managers with sufficient information to deal with the problems that you're facing down at that lake?
I think the balance that's been struck between the focus on research in the Cultus system is a balance that trades off a number of the same type of things that this commission is considering on a much larger scale. Where to invest assessment activities, where to invest restoration activities to maximize the longer term sustainability of a stock or CU. So there has been directed work supported through both direct DFO funding and species at risk funding that has made a significant contribution to our understanding of population dynamics in that system. Dr. Riddle yesterday mentioned the fact that cultus is quite unique in its history, in that it was one of the stocks that was foundational in terms of the formation of our understanding around Fraser sockeye and a lot of the initial sockeye research, going back to the days of Forrester and Ricker. So there's been a great deal of study within that system and evaluation of mechanisms that control productivity there.
And even though you have not done a nursery lake assessment program for cultus, you believe that you're playing with a full pack of cards in terms of doing your management of that sensitive issue?
I think that there has been enough of the components associated with the nursery lake evaluation. The fry assessments, those do go on, the summer and fall fry assessments, the trawl and acoustic programs are delivered, as I mentioned, opportunistically because of the situation of the lab on that lake, that we are getting strong signals with respect to fry survival trends in that system.
Dr. Riddle wanted to say something.
Well, I think you're touching on a point that is probably a bit of a frustration for staff, and I can't comment on the last couple of years, of course, because I haven't been directly involved anymore. But before leaving, we had a very aggressive program to try and maximize survivorship in the lake, and you're likely aware of extensive work with area eelnet in developing methods for removing squawfish, pike minnow we call them, and that's been a very, very successful program in maximizing survival of smolts. And that there have been
that program was paid for by industry and not by DFO. Is that not correct?
Well, they contributed substantially to it in developing the technology and the net and bringing the boat in. We paid for the staff and hiring people to work on the crew, and that. So there were joint shared costs.
Thank you.
The Species at Risk fund also contributed. But I think the comment I made about the frustration level is that one of the habitat effects, of course, is milfoil. Milfoil has been a very serious problem to control anywhere that it's got established, and we do believe that it's having an effect on spawning areas. It's probably contributing to growth of pike minnow in the system, and the other is, of course, the extensive development around margins of the lake and what that's doing in terms of changes in water flow and that. So there are habitat issues associated with it, but they are all part of the recovery program, and they are part of the research.
When you speak, Mr. Whitehouse, of the fact there are 3 lakes that you are focused on with nursery lake assessment at this point in time, would you agree with me that that small lakes and the analysis of an assessment of those lakes are now as critical as the big stock lakes for reasons of the whole direction to the CUs and the wild salmon policy, and the fact that the life and productivity of stock in these small lakes will now have a huge consequence to harvest and escapement?
I would agree that understanding the population dynamics and the carrying capacity and the relative loading of fish towards those ceilings of carrying capacity is very important to understand in terms of sustainability and understanding future production dynamics.
And you appreciate, sir, under the direction that the WSP takes us, that the health of stock in some of these small CUs can be critical to the harvest rate of my clients out in the marine environment, obviously.
Absolutely.
And therefore, you would agree with me, sir, that that it would clearly be in the interest of the commercial fishery that DFO did nursery lake assessment, not only in these 3 large lakes with large stock, but indeed with the very small areas, the CUs with small stock, because they can be totally consequential to the harvest of my clients.
It's quite clear. There's clear examples today. Cultus Lake, as a small stock within a very large complex, can have significant implications, and there is no doubt value in understanding the production dynamics associated with the populations in small lakes.
And therefore, you would agree with me that it is critical, you didn't like the word I used, tragic, but it is critical that DFO start appreciating through their funding superiors, Treasury Board, that the work has to be done in stock nursery lake assessment of small systems in light of the whole CU concept.
In light of the CU concept, I take no argument with the importance of the work. The CU concept, to me, does not elevate the information in terms of a priority. The CU is simply a construct in the way of looking at things here. So the need is clearly to understand population dynamics.
And the point I'm making is, with the adoption of the WSP and its implementation, it will become more and more critical that there be nursery lake assessment, not only of these 3 large lakes we spoke of, but of the smaller systems, because there are such consequences if those small stock do not survive to your satisfaction.
Understanding if nursery lake capacity issues are in fact the production limiting step would be important to understanding how we deal with very small stocks and their declining productivity, if, for example, it were related to conservation.
Can I clarify possibly?
Sure.
For you? Anything that's small compared to these large production stock is at some risk just because of random error and when you execute a fishery possibly. But your point is fundamentally correct, that understanding the dynamics of the small populations could become a significant limiting factor under wild salmon policy, because although CUs may be a construct, the policy clearly states that you are not allowed to take a CU to extinction through actions of management. So there will be an accountability that you have to protect the CUs in the Fraser complex. Now, the other thing I would add, though, the idea that something is small and therefore unproductive is not true. And this is actually an example that I use with students. In ecosystems that maintain their habitat and that, so if these lakes are simply now barren for whatever reason, they don't have as many sockeye, the productivity of the lake, the rate of juvenile production per spawner can be quite high. I mean, it's true even in the Adams, when you get a small stock, you get higher productivity. Well, in lakes that are small in number because of the population for a number of reasons, the productivity in the lake may be very high, right? The rate of sustainable fishing is a function of the productivity rate, right? So these, I'm agreeing with you from sort of an opposite direction in the sense that you could unduly restrict fishing opportunities because you think something is small and therefore unproductive. It is small, but it should be quite productive.
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that if any of my questions suggest that.
Yeah.
But what they are suggesting is that as we make this transition into a WSP implementation, there has to be, hand in hand with that transition, some recognition by DFO that there has to be more money put into the assessment at the nursery lake program, because small lakes suddenly gain an importance which otherwise they may not have. Do you not agree with that? That's simply my position, my suggestion.
I agree that it is important that we consider small lake assessments and the potential issues of productivity in the context of overall fisheries management, that it is an important consideration.
And particularly because of the WSP, would you not agree?
I think that the conservation obligations that arise under WSP with respect to CUs do heighten the importance of that information.
I just want to raise something for, if you could, I'll leave it with you, sir, to decide whether you want to follow up, but just so you know, I have this question in my mind and you can pursue it or not, it's up to you. We've been talking about spawning in lakes. Sockeye also spawn in streams and rivers as well, I understand. And so do your questions pertaining to habitat assessment, are you only directing those to nursery lakes? The other, are you excluding all of the other areas where these small stocks may be spawning? The other query I have is, you mentioned Cultus Lake, which I understand has a hatchery operation there, and whether that distinguishes it from other nursery lakes that may not have hatchery operations associated with it or in a nearby location.
Well, let me adopt the Commissioner's questions and deal with the latter firstly. Does the fact that Cultus has a special program, as mentioned by the Commissioner, does that in any way change the focus of DFO in terms of habitat nursery lake assessment?
The enhancement program, which is a conservation-based enhancement program designed to supplement production from wild spawning within the lake, it's important that we assess both the survival of the fry released into the system. There is a couple of different enhancement strategies that are used. Some life history might help here. There are releases into the system as fry, so that's in the year in which they hatch. In addition, some of the fish are grown up to an older stage, to that 1 year age, and released the next spring into the system. They all receive distinctive marks so that we can understand where they originate from, what release strategies, enabling us to track the survival, knowing how many are released, and the fact that they pass out through the fence at Cultus Lake, at the Swelter Creek fence, and they're all enumerated in the smolt program that we talked about yesterday. Allows us to see which are the successful enhancement components. It's a very important point from the conservation and recovery planning perspective for this stock, understanding which are successful hatchery strategies, because we really don't have a lot of experience in enhancing in a conservation-based focus within the Fraser. It's really one of the first times. So these assessments are important. We can see these marks applied to hatchery origin fish and understand if the lake is producing wild fish or hatchery fish, and whether there's differential survival rates between the two when we see them next passing out through the fence. So a number of the pieces that we've talked about in terms of the assessment program come into play in evaluating the importance of hatcheries. There is not a hatchery on Cultus system, so these fish are taken, the eggs are taken, and they're satellited out to two particular facilities, one in the Fraser Valley and one on Vancouver Island.
Thank you. And let's take the Commissioner's former question, which is that you and I have been exchanging in terms of the nursery lake assessment program, and that is exclusively, obviously, a lake analysis, a lake habitat analysis, and not at the spawning grounds. Is that correct?
Yes.
But appreciating that, and I think what flows from that in terms of the Commissioner's question might be, would you not also agree with me that with our movement or transition towards implementation of the WSP, it is critical that there be extensive habitat analysis both at the nursery lake area but also on the spawning grounds for the same reasons?
Can I tackle a bit more clarification with respect to what I heard in terms of questions? When we're talking about nursery lakes, we're talking about a place where juvenile sockeye rear. There was a question with respect to whether fry originate from spawning within the lake or from spawning within rivers. For the vast majority of sockeye stocks throughout the Fraser watershed, river or creek spawning is the predominant mode. But there are systems where there are large numbers of lake spawners. We call those beach spawners. So there's a distinction there. When we're talking about the nursery habitat, the nursery lake habitat assessments, this involves the nursery that is common to all fry originating from either beach spawning areas or from river spawning areas. as their life history results in them spending 1 year in a lake prior to leaving for the ocean, the lake is an important nursery. That's where they do their growing. They don't spend any time in their natal streams beyond the time when they emerge from the gravel and migrate immediately downstream to those lakes.
But surely there is some importance in doing habitat study of the of the spawning area and the water system that takes those fry down to the nursery lake.
Yeah, I was going there. I think it's important to understand those are essential pieces of habitat. Incubation habitat, the spawning gravels represent the seed source on an ongoing annual basis. Productive, healthy spawning habitat is crucial to productive, healthy sockeye stocks.
Yes. I don't know if the Commissioner has questions that arise out of your response to my questioning. But thank you.
Very much.
I want to move to another area. We heard from you yesterday about the tagging of fish and their migration down to the marine environment. The first question I have for you, both of you, in respect to that matter, is there a lesser survival for fish originating at a greater distance from the marine environment as opposed to those that, for example, would come out of Harrison or Cultus for that matter? Is there any information in respect to that question?
Well, the information is very limited. There will be a very different mortality schedule when you talk about Harrison, because Harrison moved through the river as fry. This is the unique nature of Harrison River fish.
Right.
They leave the river as fry. They use the lower river and estuary to grow through the phase that other lake sockeye spend in the freshwater lakes.
Let's forget Harrison.
Let's forget Harrison.
Right.
And that the information.
I'd like to forget Cultus too, I might add.
Well, I had comments on Cultus, but I'll leave it. It's very likely that there will be a relationship between distance upriver and the survivorship to the mouth. In other large systems that have been studied, that definitely is true, things like the Columbia, but they're not a very good model for undisturbed rivers. And that, I mean, we clearly don't have the dams they have to negotiate.
Yes.
And that, but there really is very, very little information on that at all.
All right.
The point really is that and Timber brought this up a couple of times, it's amazingly compressed the time that the animals use the migration period down the river. All right, so whereas we talk about fishing going on from fish returning in June right through into the end of September, the smolts that move downstream probably move down in a month and maybe only up to 6 weeks. And they move very quickly.
They do not loiter anywhere in the river system and do their loitering once they get out into the Strait of Georgia. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, they can't do a lot of loitering. Do they hold in some areas? That's quite possible, and we don't know that yet, because there will be large mixing basins where the big tributaries come in.
Now, yesterday, I think, Dr. Riddell, you spoke about your surprise that with the tagging program, you determined that there was only a 25% survival rate to the mouth of the Fraser from originating where? I forget.
Mouth of Choco Lake.
Choco Lake. First question I have for you in regards to that astonishing statistic. Has there been work done to determine whether the embedding of a chip into a fish in itself may affect its lifespan?
Yeah, there's been extensive work on that. Just the development of the technology itself. For years, David Welsh and Kintama have been working on surgical methodologies, measuring stress in the fish, how long they survive. We did exactly the same thing with the Choco study. The 200 fish that were tagged, we had another 200 fish that had what we called dummy tags inserted, the exact same weight and size, and they were retained They were actually also driven from Choco Lake to UBC and monitored for their growth, and that none of the fish that we held died. But that doesn't disprove the concern that there's a tag effect in the natural environment, and this is a lingering concern. The only way that we have been able to really convince ourselves we could do two things to test it. One is to use different tags. You could use what are called micro radio tags, a different tagging technology that doesn't go surgically, and so there are ways that you can test that concern, but that's always a concern when you tag animals and alter their behavior like that. What happens to it in nature?
Well, the fact that there's surgical intervention for the purpose of embedding a tag in itself surely isn't favorable to life expectancy.
No. When you hold these animals, there is almost no more, well, there is no mortality that we have seen yet on this. And that, so to say that would we really discard the fact that there could be substantial issues in the river that we're not even acknowledging? I don't put a lot of weight that the absolute value is going to be 25%, because as I've described, it is very much a pilot study. All right, we have not encouraged people to use this as a measure of downstream survival of Fraser sockeye. But I am concerned that we didn't see maybe 50% or higher survivorship. We saw the fish tagged over a couple of weeks. They all passed in a limited period of time to there. They seemed to stay together. And that, so, I think the people that worked in the program were really not prepared to disregard that there could be a significant in-river mortality. We are not proposing that all fish have a 75% mortality rate.
No, and in fact, with such a high mortality rate, if it did apply across the board to most of the stock, wouldn't there be visual observation with carcass identification throughout the river? No? Why?
Well, we've lost 2 million, 4 million adult sockeye salmon in the river. Have you ever seen 4 million carcasses floating on the Fraser River?
Well,
you can lose enormous numbers of animals in these large river systems. I wouldn't expect to see large numbers of smolts. The predators will pick them up extremely rapidly. And I think your point is very valid. The researchers, myself, and others certainly have concern what the effect is on the behavior of the animal with a tag, particularly going down through a very steep canyon, and we are looking at potential ways of testing that. For example, could we actually move the fish to an area to release them below the canyon? Let's see if there's an immediate jump in survivorship that way. But these are all very indirect, right?
We are going to hear more about tagging, I believe, when Dr. Carl English comes forward. I understand his focus has been very much the in-migration of fish and the tagging program as opposed to the out-migration, which you were talking about. Are we in Canada, and in particular in the west coast of Canada, cutting edge on this area of science, or are the Americans, for example, south of us, including the Columbia Basin, more, if I can put it this way, sophisticated and advanced in applying the new science that is afforded to you with the tagging system?
Well, obviously there are different environments. In Canada, in terms of the application of the new tagging technologies, I would say that many of our people are on the leading edge. But there are obviously different challenges in the Columbia Basin. I think yesterday I referred to the dams and the pit tags and the receivers. This is an amazing technology where you put a little glass tag inside a fish. It's very small. You put it in with a needle and then they build mats that detect this tag. Now the tag is passive, and so as the tag goes over the arrays, they're charged and they immediately discharge, so you can identify the animal. We don't have that technology utilized and that sort of thing. You could apply it in some special cases, but not much for going down through the Fraser. But many of our people that are working on the sonic tag, and this is the passive one that we put in surgically, and the radio tagging that Mr. English will talk to you about, many of our people are definitely leading edge on this work.
So the message to the Commissioner is that we are not falling behind in terms of this area of science.
No, I wouldn't say that's not at all.
Okay, thank you. Now, I think, Mr. Whitehouse, you did want to say something, or maybe I misunderstood your...
I just wanted to validate your current concern with respect to tagging impacts. Any study, and that includes any of the studies that we do in the terminal areas associated with tagging, key concern is representativeness of tag application. How well does a tag animal represent, and Dr. Riddle spoke about this, but how well does it represent the population at whole? That has to, whenever we're critically thinking about tagging programs, it's very important that we ask that question and put the necessary experimental pieces in place to the extent that we can to identify whether there are factors associated with tagging, like immediate mortality, the evaluation that the program working on the acoustic tagging for smolts did, to at least answer as many questions regarding representativeness as we can.
Thank you. The next area of my cross-examination is an area very critical to my client's interest, and it relates to evidence that has been tendered both by you as a panel and by previous panels, and that was the decision of DFO in, I believe, 2004 to move the threshold for stock enumeration at the spawning site from 25,000 to 75,000 fish. And I need not obviously explain what that program's about, as we've heard that evidence. My question to you, and it's on the same theme as some of the questions I've asked you previously, in the context of the WSP and the transition towards implementation of WSP, where there's more and more significance to the small stock, the small stocks and the CUs, is it not, sir, counterintuitive to have DFO around the period of the announcement of the policy in 2005 for WSP to change that threshold from 25,000 up to 75,000? Isn't it counterintuitive to the fact that more and more the small stocks are indeed going to be critical to management of the resource and indeed to my client's harvest?
The short answer is no.
Why?
I think it's quite not complex, but we have to link this to the assessment framework and the requirements for information that are used to manage Fraser sockeye. When we look at I want to clarify and make sure why the issue of the 25 to 75,000 may be a consideration and elevate in terms of concern for those who are interested in what we're doing in terms of enumeration and why. The primary issue associated with the switch is that we will have less accurate. Now, it's a bit of a misnomer, isn't it? 25,000, high precision between 25 to 75,000. The key is there's a concern that we'll have less accurate estimates for 2 or 3 populations on a yearly basis. So 2 or 3 populations that may be 50 to 75,000 fish and a return of perhaps 2 million. The key is, are we making the necessary steps to undertake the calibration work necessary to understand the relationship between the previous enumeration methods, which involve visual counting, and high precision estimation techniques, which would have involved those marker capture fence counts. And we are making progress on proceeding with understanding those calibration relationships. And it's actually an interesting point that Dr. Riddle pointed out in the document that we reviewed yesterday. The comment in that document was that visual surveys tend to underestimate abundance. And the reality of that statement is we can accept that visual surveys tend to underestimate abundance. What we don't do is simply accept that that is the estimate of abundance. We go through a process where we generate a population estimate based on those surveys. That involves the application of expansion factors, which take into account the difference between a high precision and a low precision method, is adjust the information associated with the new technique to a standard that tells us we are accounting for some of the potential bias, underestimation, associated with visual techniques. The key thing that people need to understand with respect to the move between 25 and 75 from the perspective of survey design and population sizes within the watershed is that when we make the move, the application of that factor that we use right now is for small populations. They use small habitat. There's a very discrete set of criteria that link to those surveys. And the 1.8 factor that we talked about yesterday, the expansion factor, is designed specifically for those populations. As we move to populations that can be in the 25 to 75,000 range, you actually bring in another subset of habitat within the Fraser, larger systems. And the question that needs to be asked, and I have to answer, is, are the expansion calibration factors that we use for small streams appropriate to apply to these populations that have now moved in the 25 to 75,000 range? And the question is, we are evaluating that through the calibration program. The key message is the signal in terms of abundance, using low precision methodologies for populations, whether they're under 25,000 or 75,000, we still obtain the necessary signal to understand trends in abundance associated with spawning patterns. And that is satisfactory to meet our needs under WSP, to understand the production patterns within the watershed.
But would you not agree with me? Surely it's more favorable, it's more accurate to apply high precision. I'm sorry, to apply high precision as opposed to low precision methods. You're going to get greater accuracy, are you not?
You will improve your accuracy. If your calibration program is thorough enough, though, you will get commensurate accuracy through a calibrated visual survey.
But if you're going to improve your precision, your analysis, by applying high precision and appreciating the consequences of the possibility of a stock going below the lower benchmark, is it not in the interest of everyone in the industry that high precision be applied to stock enumeration and analysis for the small stocks?
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
You wouldn't agree with that, even though I believe you are at least joining me in suggesting that high precision is a more favorable analysis and a more accurate analysis of stock enumeration than to apply the low precision method.
We can...
Just before you,
Go ahead.
Dr. Riddle, yes,
Yeah.
sorry, answer.
There's no doubt that if we had the flexibility from a budgeting perspective to implement high precision programs everywhere, we would be unable to afford a sustainable assessment on 200 plus stocks within the watershed. We're talking, you have to keep in context that we're talking about perhaps 2 or 3 populations in a given year. And as I mentioned, that when you see abundances reach the 50 to 75,000 fish range, they quickly move out of that in the sockeye world, Fraser sockeye world, and become a component of those populations that would be assessed with high precision methodologies. So I think we're really drilling into an issue that is overstating the importance of population assessment on 2 to 4 spawning sites a year.
So you speak of affordability of doing high precision on the entire watershed system. I appreciate that. Why, at least, is there not a priority to do high precision stock enumeration for those stocks that are imperiled, those stocks that may reach that lower benchmark? Couldn't you limit your program to at least give high precision analysis to those stock because of the consequences of misreading the situation and leading to harvest limits and closures?
No, I think you may be confusing the signal that we're getting. Actually, the largest uncertainty associated with the smaller stocks that we're talking about is catch accounting. The much stronger signal...
Sorry, is what?
Catch accounting. They're very small abundance in large catch, the ability to detect. So in reconstructing abundance, probably the greatest certainty that we have, even though we're using low precision methods across a number of these small stocks, is the population trend abundance that we get from spawning ground assessments using low precision estimates. So I'm not making the same leap or agreeing with the extension that you made there in terms of the argument.
Thank you. Dr. Riddell?
I don't think there's anything, logically, the way you phrase the question, wouldn't it be better? Well, of course it would be better if we had good information everywhere. If we had the money to do it, we would have done it, right? And clearly Timber is, excuse me, answering from the perspective of his current situation. He doesn't have the money. If it is only 3 or 4 systems that are a limiting factor to fisheries, then yes, there is an argument to be made for improving the information quality on the escapement, because ultimately that will be your measure of the conservation status of the stock. Right. Now, the issue here is one of, under the wild salmon policy, if you have a situation where you think that a population is below the lower benchmark, then the department is required to respond and do that. All right, so this will be a financial pressure in the future, because if it's below that, then they have to develop a recovery plan, and then surely they'll want to measure the success in recovery. Right, now, Timber is implying that most of the stocks below the 25 to 75 will recover above the 75. Well, it's quite possible, actually, that some sockeye lakes are quite happy in the 25 to 50,000 range, right? So they may never get out of that. But you can develop the lower benchmark with the methodology that you're thinking about. If you're using a visual survey and calibration standards, then you set the buffer, which is implicit in the benchmark, larger. So you set your goal so that you don't get yourself into that red zone. So you could build this in. You don't necessarily have to go to an entire mark recapture. But you can go to more defensible and more structured surveys that you have good confidence in, and you particularly want to be able to ensure that you measure any trend occurring. If you have a trend that's declining, then you want to be able to separate that from, is it consistent with the other stocks that might be associated with marine survival? Is it something going on in the fishery? And that, so you do have to be able to account for these small stocks, and the wild salmon policy requires that. So as much as right now we don't have the money, the department may simply have to do it, because that will be required in assessing the recovery.
And speaking of money, we talked yesterday, you talked yesterday, both of you, about funding issues with DFO, and I believe, Dr. Riddell, I was actually out of the room for a few minutes when you testified about the budgetary restraints, the 5% reduction, and as I have had it reported, we don't have a transcript yet, you spoke of how that 5% reduction hits the operating expenses of the budget and not the salary portion of the budget. And therefore, the 5% is really a more significant percentage than 5% because it's applied solely to the operating expenses. Is that correct?
Yes, the conversation was one of, and this does vary depending on how the reduction is defined, but if you have a 5% on total budget, that will include salaries. Typically, you will also have restrictions on what you can take the reductions in, and it frequently does not include salary, and that, but if you have a 5% off total budget, it can easily equate to a 15% of operating funds.
Right. And you having been with DFO for so many years and informing us of the consequences of 5% really being maybe 15%, that is incredibly significant to DFO's mandate to manage the fishery in British Columbia, particularly in the context of implementing WSP. Would you not agree?
Well, it's not quite that simple, because you get the 5% off the department, and it's up to the department then on how they allocate the reductions through their branches and activities, right? If it's applied equally everywhere, then yes, it's a confounding effect. And but for example, the Pacific Salmon Treaty, if you weren't in the room, that's a special allocation that is not subject to the current 5%, for example, right? And so you can have various ways that these reductions are applied. The difficulty in salmon stock assessment throughout British Columbia through my time was the regularity of the reductions. And we were only able to sustain our program because there were special allocations frequently to meet certain agreements with the United States or some other issue that came along. But there's no question that over time we've had to reduce the number of projects just to meet the budget reductions.
And if it is the choice of DFO to give priority to the sockeye programs, it obviously is at the expense of the other stocks, the other species of salmon that are not receiving the attention they should, and I think both of you have generally testified to that yesterday. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. That's definitely what we were in during my tenure as division head, that you knew that you were going to fund the Fraser sockeye as a first priority. You looked at them carefully to make sure that they were justifiable costs, but after that you had to pay for Fraser sockeye, and then you had the residual money for everything else in the province.
And as the other programs with the other species suffer, it obviously has huge consequence to my clients' interest in terms of harvest, because they're harvesting not only sockeye.
Well, not necessarily directly, but it can, yes. I mean, the example we discussed yesterday was co-assessment in the Fraser.
Yes.
Right. So that's one where there is obviously a risk of a direct limiting factor in the fisheries. And so we would try to sustain money in that because you know that it could be a limiting factor in that. But you can see that it becomes a sort of a game of dominoes, right? You're looking for the next limiting factor down the list, and you keep going down. And that, but you're right, it can definitely do that at some point.
And would you join me in agreeing that we really are facing a crisis in funding of DFO when DFO is facing down these 5% reductions? We've had testimony already from Deputy Minister Dansereau early on in these proceedings in October that she's facing another 5% budgetary cut. Does this not lead to a crisis in terms of DFO carrying out its mandate, not only in respect to exclusively to sockeye, but to all of its other programs with other species?
To be perfectly honest, I'm not really the person to comment on that. I know from my experience that if there's been 5% off total budget for the past 2 years that I've not been in DFO anymore, if you had further reductions from where we were when I left, then you're definitely dropping significant number of programs around BC in stock assessment. So I'd already written documents suggesting that we're getting down below a critical assessment level. So what I call a core assessment responsibility you have to meet.
That speaks to crisis, doesn't it?
Yeah, I guess how do you define crisis? But I mean, no question that I said yesterday in another discussion about the value that I place on long-term monitoring. Stock assessment is long-term monitoring. I mean, we do it because there is an annual need for advice for managers and management. Fundamentally, though, you're talking about the long-term monitoring of Canada's natural resources. And I see that's a core responsibility of our department, and that we put a lot of effort into.
I wonder whether you also, Mr. Whitehouse, want to make comment. I appreciate you still are with DFO, but do you have any comment to make?
I would agree with Brian. We are reaching a critical tipping point in terms of the ability, particularly in the assessment world. We're reaching a critical tipping point in terms of being able to provide the necessary monitoring, particularly outside of the Fraser. I think this is an important distinction that is worth making for this commission, that maintaining Fraser sockeye assessment has come at a high cost, and that there are not many additional pieces that can fall off without getting to the point where the word crisis could come into play.
This Royal Commission is obviously focused on the Fraser sockeye, but you would agree with me, sir, the public interest is more than simply the Fraser River sockeye, and there are huge consequences to budgetary restraint on the entire program of DFO.
It certainly, more than just Fraser sockeye, needs to be considered in terms of public interest. The consequences are large, yes.
Mr. Commissioner, I see it's 11:15 or so. I believe I might be 10, 15 minutes left, which isn't making Ms. Baker very happy. Probably not making the commission happy, but I have approximately 15 minutes, I think. I'm in your hands.
It would be nice if we could finish, Mr. Rosenblum, before we took the break, if that's possible, but it's
Happy to.
If we could break at 11:30 perhaps, and make Mr. Rosenblum get as quickly through his questions as he could, that would be great.
Happy to do that.
I just, and I'm going to complicate it a bit, I just wanted to ask quickly, the MARC recapture program that falls within the lower profile rather than the higher profile or accuracy area. I'm not completely clear about the MARC recapture program. You've mentioned it several times in different contexts, so I just want to make sure I understand it.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. There's a distinction that I need to make. First of all, mark recapture is a enumeration technique. It actually falls into the high precision suite of tools that we use. It involves tagging fish as they approach the spawning grounds, releasing them, and then allowing them to mix back in with the general population to generate an estimate with subsequent sampling.
Thank you very much.
Yesterday, an exhibit was put before you, exhibit number 385, and I don't think it's necessary to put it on the screen. This was Mr. Sato's letter to the two commissioners of the Pacific Salmon Commission in regards to the concern of the Fraser River panel over stock enumeration back in 02-03. My question to you is, you, Mr. Whitehouse, I believe yesterday you were asked whether you know of other written communication from the Fraser River panel and the commission to the commission regarding concerns after 2003, and I believe you said no. Are you testifying that there has not been any form of communication, either orally or in writing, from the panel expressing concern about stock enumeration after 2003?
No, that's not what I'm testifying to at all.
Okay.
In fact, the response would have been, could I identify specific examples like that letter? No. I'm well aware that in the interval between 2002 and present, there have been numerous occasions on which the Fraser River panel has expressed concern with respect to budgetary impacts at various stages during the planning process each year.
And has that expression been communicated to you by document or by documents?
Directly to me, no. It would flow through a different route, but it's safe to say at some point I would see those concerns expressed.
So you are aware that there has been written communication from the panel or through the Pacific Salmon Commission to DFO expressing concern about the quality or quantity of stock enumeration subsequent to 2003?
I'm aware of repeated communication.
Yes, and are you aware whether that communication, I haven't seen that documentation, maybe it exists in the body of whatever we have now, 500,000 documents on Ringtail, has that communication suggested that DFO is in non-compliance with the international treaty obligations of this country with the U.S. By failing a proper standard of stock enumeration?
Important to make a distinction here. They're normally responding to proposed assessment plans that may be shaping up. They're iterative through a season. As we talked about, there's a preliminary budgeting stage and an impact statement like the one we saw yesterday. That would be a May timeline. And then subsequent to those impact statements, they're generally budget adjustments, and they are largely exercises to find ways to fund pressures that Fraser sockeye represent. Brian spoke about this. In a number of cases, the response comes from the panel very early in the year, expressing concerns that if the program profile as currently identified proceeds, there will be significant deficiencies. And as a result, with the exception of 3 years that we talked about, we have found a way to fund the full suite of Fraser River sockeye spawning ground assessments on an annual basis.
So we're back to rectifying the deficiencies and satisfying the panel and the commission at the expense of other programs of DFO, because you're unable to get, you can't secure further funding from Ottawa for it.
No.
Yes.
Correct?
Well, not necessarily.
Well, first of all, for the record, correct?
What happens is, for the record, we make adjustments to the budgets based on reductions proposed, and then division head, RD of science, and the senior executive within the region, having been made aware of gaps in the program, then find funds to address that.
And those funds are within the operating budget of DFO, the existing operating budget.
I don't know the source of those.
I'm sorry, Dr. Riddell.
Well, I'm sorry for butting in like that. But the only reason for qualifying is that once we get into a situation where the budget is allocated, it's very possible that at something at an international level, that the resources could be easily found in Ottawa in DFO, or they could be found in Ottawa more generally. Right? They would not necessarily require us to resort to canceling programs in midsummer or something like that. I never did that in my time. I think your question, the way you phrase it about has Canada been in writing accused of not meeting the requirements of the treaty, I think it's honest to say that that sort of statement between governments would be seldom made, and if made would be in writing at an international level, not something that we would typically see at the working level on the West Coast. We might hear about it and be required to sort of respond to how we're compensating, but I don't think it's too surprising that we wouldn't have seen something in writing that would say something of that nature.
Well, Dr. Riddell, you're now with your foundation. Does your foundation take the position that stock enumeration, as currently carried out by DFO, does meet international obligation?
I can honestly say I don't think anybody in our foundation has actually discussed that. As a Canadian commissioner, I certainly have a concern about where the funding is trending for a stock assessment in the Fraser.
Thank you. Moving on, if I may, one of my last areas of examination relates to your testimony, Dr. Riddell, given yesterday, where we really got to the essence of the mandate of this inquiry by asking ourselves, can we explain away, for example, 2009 run from 2010, and you particularly focused on the lack of marine assessment, what I think you called the early marine assessment, I assume to be the Strait of Georgia and maybe Johnson Strait. I want to focus for just a few minutes in respect to your testimony in that regard. Firstly, can you explain why this assessment, the marine assessment, has not been carried out up to this point in time? What's the explanation?
Well, that was an argument that I had in the House for several years, because we're talking about Fraser sockeye now, but you could equally be concerned at looking at the change in recreation on commercial fishing for Chinook and coho salmon since the mid-'80s, where conservatively we'll have lost about 1.5 million fish a year. All right, that's a huge reduction, where we have seen through the hatcheries that there's been a significant drop in marine survival. The more we've learned indicates that marine survival is likely being determined in the early phases of when these animals go to sea. And that, why has the department not responded with a intensive investigation of that ecosystem? I cannot give you a good answer. I can say, though, that it would be 5 or 6 years ago, we did implement a limited program called the Ecological Research Initiative, and that was in the Strait of Georgia. It was to be designed as a much larger program, but it was limited to about $300,000 a year for 5 years. And but there are a number of organizations very interested in examining the ecosystem in the Strait of Georgia now. In terms of, there's obviously been huge changes. One of the most notable for the public is the growth of the seal population and the impact of that. When you really start to investigate it, one of the things we know almost nothing about is the fish communities of the small pelagic fishes. We talk about groundfish, and we talk about some shellfishes, and we talk about salmon. We very seldom talk about the animals that are probably the food base for many of these species. So there's a lot of concern. I don't have a good answer why.
On his report at the end of the day, and if he chose to try to influence Ottawa to put more focus on the inner marine environment and assessment, do you have any sense of the kind of costs that the government would face in having a robust program of marine investigation?
Well, I do, actually, because at the request of a private donor, 2 years ago I put together a ecosystem-based study of the Strait of Georgia to answer the specific question about the loss of Chinook and coho salmon. And that program, after extensive consultation with our universities and the government labs, came out to be $10.5 million over 5 years. It sounds like a big number, but in my personal assessment, $2 million a year with the potential return of an area that is so important to British Columbia and Canada is almost trivial. But you got to go and find it.
You didn't get your money?
No, I think there was too much science, apparently, and unfortunately that donor decided to not follow through. The Salmon Foundation, though, has made a commitment that we will proceed to try a campaign to raise those funds, and we're actually I will be meeting with 2 U.S. government groups when I'm down in Portland.
What about DFO?
I think DFO will contribute if we can find some of the funds. I think right now that $10 million commitment over time would be fairly large. I think that when the groups actually see that there is some private funding for this, that we will get government involved, but we've got to go a ways. But it is designed now to be a very intensive study for 2 years to test many of the ideas that people have, and then establish an active recovery for Chinook and coho while conducting. There are 14 specific projects to test people's ideas of what's going on in the Strait.
Why, Dr. Riddle, is your mindset that these kind of programs should be privately funded as opposed to exclusively government funded? Isn't this in the public interest that the government of Canada pay for these kind of critical studies?
Yeah, I don't think it's fair to say it was my mindset. I responded to a request by individuals that had the wealth to do this. We took it very seriously and wrote what I think is a very professional proposal, and that the individual decided it wasn't quite what he wanted and decided not to. Now, who funds it now? I think it's a government-private support, a corporate support. Any way that we could fund it is equally as important.
But don't you agree that primarily it should be the fiscal responsibility of the government of Canada to carry out these kind of studies?
I mean, obviously, I think that there is a yes to this, but the reality of fundraising, and I am learning this because of my recent 2 years, there are many, many government priorities that we're fighting against, and if we can do it jointly, we're more likely to make some progress, basically.
I'm pleased to say that completes my questioning. I thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. If you would like to take the break now, this would probably be a good time. The next and final questioner for these witnesses is Brenda Gartner, or perhaps it's Leah Pence, I'm not sure, but that team.
We will now recess for 15 minutes.